Welcome back. The Just Ask Me program at the Women's Housing and Economic Development Corporation is a peer-led sexual education and reproductive health program for students in 6th through 8th grade. The program provides awareness and knowledge to middle schoolers about sexual health and relationships. Joining us in studio to give more information about this program is the President of WHEDco, Davon Russell, and their Health Education Coordinator, Katie Shillman. Thank you both so much for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
Now, can you tell us a little bit more about the WHEDco JAM program and what inspired its creation?
So what inspired its creation was there was a group of young women, they were in the 7th grade at the time, back in 2007, who were expressing in a community service exercise that too many of their relatives, in some cases, or peers in the neighborhood, were experiencing early pregnancies. And they felt that there wasn't enough being shared with them about their sexual health. And they wanted more and advocated the school to incorporate sexual education, sexual reproductive health education into the curricula. That grew to a citywide advocacy effort and culminated in the city mandating sexual and reproductive health education into the school curricula across New York City, and the creation of the Just Ask Me program at our place.
Now, what makes this program unique compared to other after-school or community initiatives?
One of the things that we learned in, how do you reach young people, especially with information such as their sexual and reproductive health, was the idea of peer education. And that's one of the things that stood out for us, and that was one of the goals of the program at the time, built around the idea that these young people are going to learn from each other. Now, there is a bit of a disparity between the ages of the people who are delivering. They're in high school or in college, but they're delivering to 6th, 7th, and 8th graders, and they have found this to be a very efficient model because the disparity is not that great, and they do find that this group appeals to them with this information sharing. So it actually works.
Now, as you mentioned, it started back in 2007, and it's been some time since then, so of course things had to evolve. And what I think is super interesting is that over time there has been some curriculum changes, and I understand one of them is social media safety, digital literacy, and mental health, which, if I can remember, that wasn't super huge things that people discussed back in 2007. So can you talk about the importance of incorporating those topics, while we're teaching young women?
So one of the things I'll touch on just for briefly, and then I'll turn it over to Katie. The mental health aspect has always been a part of our ethos. We have always had mental health supports within our programs in after school, recognizing that our families are dealing with a lot of stressors. Shifting to the focus in the peer-led program has been new and started more around the time of the pandemic, because that just kind of unleashed a whole other set of anxieties. So Katie can talk a little bit more about what that has meant for how we push in with the students.
Yes, and in conjunction with the pandemic, obviously students were using screens and technology a lot more, and there's just over the course of years been the continued proliferation of social media and different apps and devices. So at younger and younger ages, young students are on social media whether they should be or not. And there aren't really guardrails or information guidelines given to them to traverse that very complex environment in safe ways. And so each year as we go back to the schools and ask parents and teachers and students themselves, what are things that are of a concern for your community? What are impacting the students day to day? Time and time again, we're hearing social media and phone usage. And so we wanted to make sure that this year and years to come that we're addressing that distinct need and talking about social media and digital literacy.
And speaking of social media, what are some of the biggest challenges middle schoolers face today?
So there's so much, right? And they're not really given that information. There isn't really that space provided for them, whether in their schools or back home or in their communities. So that's one of the great things that WHEDco is doing, where we're not just having these conversations with the students themselves during the jam sessions, but we're also having parent workshops where parents can come in and talk about how they can have these discussions with their high school students, their toddlers, whoever it is, to make sure that those support systems are implemented for them wherever they are in their lives.
Now, what I really would love to touch on, which I think is amazing, is that they're peer educators. Can you explain the importance of having, children kind of learn about heavy topics from their peers?
So definitely, I think one of the central tenets of our program, as Davon mentioned, is that we have our peer educators who oftentimes just a couple years ago were in those same seats that these students we're teaching are in. They have this very lived experience of what it's like to be Generation Alpha in the Bronx, and understand what it's like to deal with dating and gossip and social media and whatever it is, that no matter how talented or educated an educator is who comes in, they're not going to be able to relate on that very personal, deep level that is so essential when we are talking about these very personal, sensitive topics. So it is very incredible to see, as the educator, see that very quick connection that the peer educators are able to make with the students.
Now, what kind of training do these peer educators go through to prepare them for their roles?
So we obviously are trying to empower them to become student leaders and educators within their peer groups. The goal is not just that they come into the workshops once or twice a week to teach middle schoolers, but that they're also an advocate and resource for their own friends and peers in high school and college. So we, of course, go through the JAM curriculum and going through these very nuanced, complex topics in depth and have these very enlightening conversations about how not just the information itself, but also how does the media portray it? How does society talk about it? How do our different cultures talk about it as we discuss these very personal topics? But then in addition to the curriculum, also focus on those professional development skills of classroom facilitation, public speaking, helping them feel empowered to take that stand at the front of the classroom instead of just sitting down and participating as a student.
Now, how does the JAM program equip middle schoolers with tools and strategies for self-care, which I think is very important because even adults now are kind of, tapping into self-care and what that means. So how do you convey that message to middle schoolers?
Yeah, I think on social media, a lot of times there's some dangerous messaging of what self-care is supposed to look like. And so we focus on that there's a huge range of anything that looks like self-care, and it's very personal what your preference is, and that could also change throughout your life. So there is an activity that we do with the students where they develop their own personal toolkits. And they brainstorm 5 different things that they can do when they're feeling stressed or overwhelmed, things that bring them a sense of calm or joy, people that they can talk to who can help lift them up. And we share ideas, and it's incredible. Like sometimes I have 15 different things shared, and it's never the same thing. So that helps emphasize that there's a lot of different things that they can do to cope with those stressors.
Now, I would love to hear from both of you. What role does community and family support play in reinforcing the lessons students learn through JAM? And I think this is also very important because community and family could also be maybe a challenge that some of the girls are going through. So when they do have somebody who's supportive, can you just talk about the role that plays and how important that is?
So family engagement is one of the true pillars of our work in all aspects, and especially when it comes to, you're talking about school-age children, where do family and what does family represent for them? One of the things that we start every year with is an outreach to families. And by families, I don't want to say parents, because in some cases they're caretakers and not exactly a biological parent or some other relative. And that buy-in is crucial, because we could do a ton of work at school, but then what happens when the student goes home? So it's important that families are coming in, and Katie mentioned the fact that we're doing facilitated workshops for families. That's a key portion of the work, is to get them involved as well, because in some cases, if you don't do that, then you're losing on the other end. So that's a very key part of our work, to get the families involved.
And just to expand on that, how can, just parents or community members watching, how can they get involved and support JAM?
Yeah, so we are always looking for more peer educators. So if parents do have a high school or college student going to school in the local area, we'd love to have them reach out. They're interested in learning more about sexual and reproductive health and all these other topics we now teach, and looking for that leadership role. That's definitely an exciting opportunity. And then we also have those parent workshops that are always coming out.
Now, what I think is super interesting is that everything is always changing, and what it meant to be a middle schooler 15 years ago is different from what it is now, and I'm sure it's going to change 15 years from now. So with that, how do you see the JAM program evolving in the future to meet the needs of middle schoolers?
The key thing is that we're always listening. I mean, it started with the listening to those young women back in 2007, and it's evolved over time to include always getting the feedback. We spent an enormous amount of energy hearing from the young people. We do the assessment surveys at the beginning of the year and are always thinking, what's next? And so we're listening to them, and we're, of course, observing what their world is like, right? We started substance abuse and bringing that back 2 years ago because New York was about to legalize cannabis. So that was an evolution and that we felt like we had to address. So it will be constant, always relying on what we're hearing from them and, of course, the reality of the world at that time.
Now, what advice would you give to other educators or community leaders looking to create similar programs to protect, youth in New York City?
Yeah, I think there's a ton of really great resources online. There's some curriculums and lesson plans developed by national organizations, but also we benefit living in New York City. There are a ton of different amazing organizations working on similar work and projects. And I think all of us are very excited and wanting to collaborate. There's power in numbers, power in that collaboration. So reaching out and making those connections and seeing what is possible is really like the way forward.
And I just want to say that I think this is an amazing program. I love to hear that it was actually from children who said, hey, this is something that I'm noticing and I'm not okay with this. Is there something that we can do to change this? I love to hear that and to see that so many years later
It was
still
powerful in real time.
Yeah,
It was powerful to watch them present the petition to the principal of the school
Oh, wow.
and ask for signatures. It was just one of the most amazing things that I'd ever been a part of.
I think that's amazing. And, thank you so much for sharing that story with us and sharing what your organization is doing to protect those girls. So thank you so much, both of you, for joining us.
And young boys.
Yes, and young boys, of course. Yes, thank you so much for
Thank
joining
you.
us.
Thank you for having us.
To learn more about the JAM program, please go to their website, WHEDco.org. Stay tuned. We have more for you right after this.